Hey YouTube, Brian here, back with another video. First, I just want to thank everyone that watched our last video for all of your love and support, and I'm glad that these videos are helping some of you improve your own play. Because of that, we're back today with another gameplay and commentary video, but this time with a small change. Last video I showed you a variety of different replays, but going forward I'll be splitting replays into categories so that each video focuses on one particular aspect of Malice. This video in particular, we're bringing back the Boogeyman of all banished decks, of course, Artifact Lancea. All the games I show today are going to be post-side games where my opponent drops Lancea on me, and I'll show everyone how Lancea is often not an auto-win card against Malice if you play your own interruptions effectively. As usual, if you like this type of video and want to see more, let us know in the comments and by liking the video or by joining our Discord. With that, let's get into the replays. So in this replay, you can see that our opening hand is pretty good. It's not ideal to open double Dormouse, but Dormouse plus a Bystial is one of the strongest 2-card combos this deck can have, as well as we have the Gold Sark as another extender should we need it. But as we start our turn, you can see our opponent Lancea us here, and I'm just going to pass the turn back to my opponent. Now my opponent is on Mermaid Atlantean, so they go ahead and go for Shrine effect to summon Coelacanth, and then use Coelacanth effect to try and summon a whole bunch of monsters from their deck. Thankfully, we have the Veiler to stop their Coelacanth, and Coelacanth was their only play, so they're just going to battle phase, attack, and pass their turn back to us. Now, they are going to go for their Shrine draw here, hoping to draw into some kind of hand trap, I suppose. But with this kind of hand, even though we did draw a third normal summon, which is pretty bad, we can very easily close out the game here. So you can see I just go through my names and set the TB11, and as usual, I go for my low commitment OTK line where I just summon Cryptor on summon 4. I don't even play into the Nibiru, and I go straight for the battle phase. And I also just Bystial in the battle phase to get a name banished to use my Cryptor effect. That way we make sure that we don't overextend into a card like Nibiru. And as I attack my opponent, you'll see that they reveal they drew a Fool Loss for their Shrine draw, I presume. But that won't be enough to stop us. So in this replay, you can see that we've again opened a pretty good hand. Opening 2 Underground is not ideal, but we do have the Chessy Cat to go ahead and banish one of them in order to get our draw 2. We have our Bystial as an extender, as well as Ash to stop any possible Molcharmies our opponent might throw at us. But as we start our turn, we can see that our opponent, of course, drops Lancea on us. And here, because this is post-side, I know my opponent is on Malice as well. So I go ahead and normal summon my Chessy Cat and make Lingaribo. Now, Lingaribo doesn't fully stop my opponent's Malice combos, but Lingaribo here acts as a like kind of a mind game, because when you have Lingaribo, your opponent is incentivized to use their battle phase to clear the Lingaribo first, so that they can actually get use out of their trap cards. It's kind of like the same principle of like making hieratic seals, and your opponent basically always is tempted to immediately go into battle phase to clear the hieratic seals effect. And the important part here is just that we live until the next turn. Like, I actually don't care if my Lingaribo gets value or not. As long as we can survive to the next turn, we're in a very good position to still win this game. So the Lingaribo here, very simply to goad my opponent into wasting their battle phase. But my opponent here is going to start with Dormouse. They're going to get Chessy Cat, and they're going to use Chessy effect to try and draw. Now, I ash the Chessy here, even though ashing Chessy means they can still play, because they can go into Lizard banish Chessy, Lizard banish Dormouse, and then make their red ransom and keep comboing that way. However, my second priority is to stop my opponent from possibly drawing into a second Lancea, because that's one of the ways that we can get blown out of the water in this game, is if our opponent Lanceas us twice in a row. So here I just ash the Chessy so that there's no chance of our opponent drawing more non-engine that can make us pass another turn. And our opponent go ahead and extends with a copy of Underground. And they're going to go for their White Rabbit, setting TB11 from their deck. And here, you'll see my opponent goes into the battle phase, and we have successfully baited our opponent into wasting their battle phase, putting me on a life total that is nowhere near low enough to secure the game. And in main phase 2, they're going to make Decoder, and they're going to make Red Ransom, and they're going to use Red Ransom 1, Decoder 2. Now here, I do have a Serenir in my hand, and I can use Serenir to banish the Decoder from their graveyard. But this is a mistake I see a lot of players make, is just they just shotgun Bystial at the first chance of something that they can get value out of. But you really have to analyze the board state and think, okay, does banishing this Link Decoder actually achieve anything? And the answer for this board state is a definitive no, because even if I Serenir banish this Decoder, my opponent still has a set TB11, so they go TB11, banish their Red Ransom, summon any name from the deck, their Red Ransom will trigger summoning herself, and they have not used their Dormouse effect yet, so they can banish Dormouse from their deck and still get plenty of Link material on board to go into White Binder or go into Cryptor. So I opt to not banish the Link Decoder here, I just let my opponent play and save my Serenir for a better opportunity later on. And here, my opponent makes a weird play and goes for Dark. Now if you ask me, this is SP 100% of the time, and you should Little Knight banish your Ransom to continue comboing and also to play around Nibiru. I don't know why my opponent goes for Dark here. Maybe they just wanted to steal something out of my graveyard and keep SP in their extra deck for use later on. But in any case, my opponent tries to take my Chessy Cat here, and they get hard punished by the Serenir that I held in my hand. So I use Serenir to banish my Chessy Cat, and that prevents my opponent from taking it. And as I try to use my Chessy Cat effect, my opponent opts to cross out it, hoping that I won't have another starter next turn. And so we don't get our Chessy back, but that's fine because we're guaranteed to live until the next turn, and our opponent just passes. So from this position, we know that our opponent has a Dark and a TB11 set, which means they have 0 interaction on the field, and the only thing we have to worry about is some kind of interaction from their hand. So we start our turn, we draw MTP07, which is honestly not a very good draw, but we'll make do with it. So we start with Underground, and we'll go Underground banishing Dormouse, and then we'll set the MTP07 to dodge any Imprims or Veilers our opponent might have, and as I go to use my Dormouse effect here, my opponent is just going to surrender, as they probably don't have any other interaction in their hand. So in this replay, you can see that we've opened an okay hand. We do have 2 Bystials, however our only starter is terraforming into Underground, which is not ideal, and we've drawn our GWC06, which is not great since we can't use it to dodge Effect Veiler or Impermanence. We did draw Solemn Strike, which is fantastic in case our opponent Lanceas us, and you can see that here our opponent does exactly that. So I'm just going to set my Solemn Strike and pass back to my opponent. I don't use my Terraforming here, just to hide as much information as possible from my opponent, and our opponent is going to start their turn by using Maiden effect, and I will Solemn Strike that. And while I can hold the Solemn Strike for, let's say they go Maiden, they set True Light, they use True Light to set Wishes, and then they go Wishes to add Sage and Cries. I could Solemn Strike the Sage there so that they commit their normal summon, but the issue is then they have access to their True Light, and they have Cries in their hand, and they can keep playing from there. So I just want to cut off any possible chance of follow-up they have, because one of the ways that I do lose this is if they Lancia me again, and they use their True Light to get a Wishes for follow-up. So I just cut off all of their plays by going Strike on the Maiden. And usually you don't want to start with the Maiden if unless it's your only starter. So stopping the Maiden is a pretty good choke point against Blue Eyes. Anyway, they're going to normal summon Veiler, and they're going to go ahead and make their Spirit, and they're going to use Spirit to add Mausoleum, then use Mausoleum to go ahead and send Blue Eyes from their deck to the graveyard. Now here you have to be very careful when you play against Blue Eyes. You want to, on Resolution and Mausoleum, go ahead and Bystial their Blue Eyes White Dragon, because Spirit tributes for cost. So if you wait until they use Spirit effect, your Bystials will no longer be quick effects since your opponent controls no monsters. So here I go ahead and Bystial the Blue Eyes so that they can't use their Spirit effect, and their Maiden is also dead in the graveyard, and they pass their turn back to me. I don't opt to Baldrake banish their Maiden from their graveyard just because their Maiden is dead right now, so there's not really a need to, and I'd rather keep the Baldrake for my turn in case I top deck a normal summon of one name, so that I can use my Bystial as an extender instead. And here we can see the top deck is not great, it's just an MTP07, so our opponent will Lancia us a second time, which is unfortunate, but we can still deal with it. So I go ahead and use my Baldrake here to banish their Maiden, just to go ahead and establish some more board presence, and then I go Battle Phase to attack over everything, and then I move to main phase 2 and I go for Terraforming. My opponent is going to Ash the Terraforming, which is fine because the Underground wouldn't have been useful this turn anyway, and I just set my MTP07. I could overlay my 2 Bystials to make a Crazy Beast here to get rid of the Mausoleum of White, but I don't see Mausoleum of White being super high value for them since they're on so few cards. The additional normal summon probably won't really come up, and I'd rather keep the Bystial, the Baldrake Banish around. So my opponent draws for turn, and as they go to their main phase, they will concede as they have no starters in their hand. So with this opening hand, you might be able to tell, but we are playing a Malice mirror match, and this hand is not the craziest hand. It's a bit too engine heavy. We have 2 names and then 2 field spells, which is not the place you want to be, but we do have the Lancia to at least buy us a turn. So as we start our turn here, our opponent is going to Lancia us, of course, and no reason for us to play anything, so I go ahead and just pass back to my opponent. Now I could normal summon and make the Lingaribo here, but really, since I have the Lancia already, I'm just going to let Lancia do the heavy lifting and kind of just preserve the cards in my hand, again, to hide information from my opponent. So here, my opponent is going to normal summon Dormouse, and I'm going to go ahead and chain the Lancia. Now, something very important in the mirror match is if you are the one going first, your opponent Lancias you and you pass back to your opponent, do not fire your Lancia in the draw phase or standby phase. And the reason is because since you are going first, you've probably sided out your Fool losses, but your opponent is going second, which means they for sure have Mulcharmies in their deck if they are playing it. So things like Fool Loss and Meows, post side are definitely very common. And if you go ahead and Lancia your opponent in draw or standby, and they have one of the Charmies in their hand, they can just pass back to you and then just Charmy you, and then you might be forced to pass back to your opponent another time. So since if you wait until your opponent commits at least 1 card, either the normal summon or underground, just something that stays on their field, and then you Lancia them, you not only stop their turn, but you also make it so that any Charmies in their hand are dead. So I do that here. My opponent is forced to just go battle phase and attack with Dormouse and then pass their turn. So for our turn, we draw a Solemn Strike, which is actually very good in this situation. Solemn Strike is just very insane in the mirror match, and I'll talk more about Solemn Strike here in a moment, but I'm just going to set the strike as a bluff and then normal summon Dormouse and use her effect. And I go ahead and go for Chessie here to try and get this White Rabbit out of my hand, and my opponent goes for a Druiswarm. I don't know why, maybe they misclicked, it doesn't really do anything here, but I'll use Chessie Cat to go ahead and banish my Rat Rabbit, and I draw another Lancia on the top, which yeah, it's very strong, and we draw the MTP07, which is not great, but it's still something. So I trigger my White Rabbit, and I summon White Rabbit back, and I set my GWC06. I don't set my TB11 here because I'm planning to go for another low commitment Cryptor play. And you can see here, I just used my field spell here to banish a Dormouse, so I can get a target for my Cryptor's banish effect. Because assuming my opponent has no other interruption from their hand, this is a very easy kill setup. And so I go battle phase, I use my Cryptor to kill their Dormouse, and then I use Cryptor effect to banish their Druiswarm. And then my opponent reveals that they did indeed have a Mulcharmy, so if I had not waited until they normal summoned Dormouse to use my Lancia, they would have just passed back to me and then just Fool lost me back. So that's one reason that's very important. So here I go ahead and use GWC, I banish my Cryptor, summon back my Chessie, and my Cryptor will come back at 56 attack, and this is more than enough for game, as long as my opponent doesn't have anything, but unfortunately my opponent did have a second Bystial in the Magnemite. So they're going to go ahead and Magnemite their Dormouse, and use both Mag effect and Dormouse effect, and unfortunately that will chuck block me from killing them. That is kind of one of the risks about going for this low commitment OTK line, is if your opponent has a Bystial, they can just chump block you so that you aren't able to kill them. But in this case, it's still fine because we can still combo in main phase 2, so I just kill both their monsters, I go to main phase 2, I make SP. Partly because I kind of forgot about the Fool loss, because they just dropped it in the battle phase, and then I was just concentrating on trying to kill them. So I forget that Fool loss was in play, and I make my SP here. And I try to combo further. What I should have done was just left my Cryptor and Chessie Cat on the field, not given them a single draw and just pass back to them. Because it's very unlikely that they're going to be able to break through a Strike, a MTP set, and then also a Lancia in my hand. But in this situation, I misplay and I go ahead and make the SP. I banish my Dormouse, and then since I already committed into the Fool loss, I thought I might as well go ahead and give them one more draw in order to make my White Binder and set back my GWC so that I get more follow-up. So that's exactly what I'm going to do here, and then I'm going to pass back to my opponent. So my opponent is going to end phase, use Mag to search for Baldrake, and then they're going to go ahead and use Baldrake to banish my Cryptor, which is also kind of questionable because GWC can banish from both Grave and Banished, so banishing the Cryptid here doesn't really accomplish anything. So my opponent is going to summon their Baldrake, and then they're going to go ahead and normal summon White Rabbit. Now here, I want to talk a bit more about Solemn Strike. So, a very common thing I see people do is they use their Solemn Strike like a slightly better Imperm. They'll Solemn Strike the first name that they see. And I'm going to tell all of our Malice players here a secret. Do not use this on the normal summon name. Always hold this for the first Link 3. If you hold it for the first Link 3, it is very hard to recover from, because when you strike the summon of a Link monster, it's not considered properly summoned. So if you strike the summon of Red Ransom, for instance, and your opponent tries to Bystial the Red Ransom, the Red Ransom actually can't trigger in the banished pile, because extra deck monsters that were not properly summoned first cannot summon themselves from the graveyard or from the banished. And so, and also if your opponent links for a Link 3 using Link Decoder, and you strike the summon of the Link 3, the Link Decoder cannot trigger to bring itself back, because Link Decoder has to be used for the Link summon of a monster with 23 or more attack. But if the summon of the monster was not successful, it will not be treated as being used as a material for that Link summon. So holding the Solemn Strike for the Link 3 is very, very important. And, you know, this is something that, you know, don't tell anybody else. You know, let's make sure everyone who doesn't know about Malice keeps striking our normal summons, because striking the normal summon is very easy to recover from. You just use a Bystial to banish it. But, you know, just between us, always use your Solemn Strike on the first Link 3. So here I just let the rabbit go because I don't care. My opponent is going to go for a Dark to steal my rabbit. I don't care about that either. I've played none of my cards so far. I don't even flip my Lancia because I just don't need it. I know that I can just wait until my opponent makes the first Malice Link 3. That's where I go ahead and Solemn Strike them. And here, my opponent is going to Underground, and that's where I Lancia my opponent, just to make sure they don't, you know, are up to any shenanigans. And then I flip my GWC06 during the end phase to get my Cryptid back. But my opponent impulses my GWC06, which is a bit annoying, but not the biggest deal, because next turn we still have all the follow-up we could possibly want. And as I start my turn, I go ahead and flip my MTP07, just to get rid of this last back row that they just set. And you'll see here that it was actually a GWC06, and my opponent chose not to chain it, which I'm not sure why, but even if they chained it, like I said before, this white binder is not properly summoned, so it cannot be summoned back by GWC06, which means even if they had flipped their GWC06, their only targets are a white rabbit as well as a dormouse, and both don't do anything, because even if the white rabbit sets their MTP07 doesn't represent a banish, and they are basically out of moves here. And we know this is the TB11, they set off their white rabbit, so we know 100% that there is no interaction from our opponent anymore, and we can just very easily kill our opponent. I use my white binder, set back my GWC, I use my dormouse, and the rest of this is, just a quick jump over to access code, and that's the end of the game. So in this replay, you can see that our hand is, again, pretty good. We have two names in our hand, which is not ideal, but we do have the Bystial as the extender, we have talents in case our opponent hand traps us, and we have the Solemn Strike in case they Lancia us, and that is exactly what's going to happen as our opponent drops it in the draw phase. And I'm going to go ahead and normal summon my white rabbit and set TB11 from the deck, and then make a Lingaribo here. Now this is actually not the mirror match, since this is post side. I know my opponent is actually on Trap Labyrinth, so this Lingaribo is going to be very strong in this matchup in particular. So I set my Solemn Strike and I pass the turn back to my opponent, and my opponent's just going to set the 4 impasse. So here during the end phase I flip TB11, so the next turn I can immediately start using the effect of my Cheshire Cat. And the reason I go for Chessy Cat here specifically is just I want to draw into more cards that can answer all of these back row, more extenders that can play through more back row. And so at the start of my turn, I immediately go for my Chessy, and my opponent is going to Solemn Strike it. As I've said before, if my opponent were a smarter player, they would have known to just hold the Solemn Strike, but here, that's not a big deal at all. Then I go Baldrake to banish my white rabbit, and my opponent is going to try and Ice Dragon's Prism me, and that is going to be a bit annoying, so I just go ahead and Lingaribo it so that I can get my white rabbit, and then white rabbit can set me another trap just to even further combo during this turn. Now, I make the Link Decoder here, and then I make for SP. Even though I don't get the Link Decoder effect, I just wanted a Link 1 that could fulfill SP's requirement to banish a card on the field, because I just want to try and clear as many of these back row as possible before I commit to my actual Link 3s. Just because, like I said before, like if you commit a Link 3 and it gets Solemn Striked, you're going to be in a very bad situation. So here, I'm going to basically spend all the cards that I have to try and get rid of as many of these as possible, and then use Gold Sark as my last extender to make my actual Link 3 combos. But here, I'm going to SP banish their other back row, which is the Karma Cannon. And Karma Cannon is kind of weird against this deck. It is very good if you just use it as like a Book of Moon. But if your opponent holds Karma Cannon for too long, they could just get absolutely no value out of it. Because if you don't know, Karma Cannon has to flip a monster face down in order to send Link monsters to the graveyard. And here, my opponent actually isn't even able to flip the Karma Cannon because no monsters on the field can be set face down. So they're not even able to use the Karma Cannon in response in order to just get rid of my Little Knight. And then as I normal summon my Dormouse here, we haven't even normal summoned yet. Our opponent is going to go ahead and concede because they have no interaction left. So for this last replay here, you can see that we've again opened a pretty good hand. We have a starter in the White Rabbit, we have an extender in the Magnemite, we have an additional extender in the Gold Sark, and we have talents to rip our opponent's hand if they use any hand traps against us, and we even have a Dominus Impulse in case we get Lancea. Now, if you guys watched my deck profile, you know that I did not play Impulse when I got first place at Seattle Regionals. I am testing around with it in place of Phantasme for the 3v3 Team YCS at Las Vegas. But here, our opponent is actually going to be starting in this game, and they're going to start by normal summoning White Rabbit and using White Rabbit to set TB11. Now they're going to flip the TB11 here, and I don't choose to use the Impulse. Now I think at the time, I was trying to hold the Impulse for the Red Ransom effect in the Banished, as well as the White Binder effect in the Banished. I think that's where you can get the most value out of your Impulse. However, I think in retrospect, I should have impulsed the TB11 here, because when you start with White Rabbit and you use TB11 to banish the White Rabbit, it very, very likely means your opponent has no extenders in their hand. Because usually you don't want to go this line since it plays very hard into Nibiru. Like if you start White Rabbit and you're forced to use TB11 right away, you can't get to your Link 3 on your 5th summon, because your White Rabbit would have been summoned 1, this Dormouse is summoned 2, this White Rabbit is summoned 3, Lizard would be summoned 4, and then you Lizard banish your Dormouse, and that Dormouse would be summoned 5. So you would be playing right into Nibiru before you can get to your Link 3. And usually, if you're playing against like even a semi-decent player, they'll know that, and if they have an extender in their hand, they'll play it so that they can play around Nibiru that way. So if they had a Bystial, then they probably would have linked off their White Rabbit into Decoder and then used their Bystial to banish White Rabbit. That way they can make their Link 3 under 5 summons. Since they didn't do that and they were forced to use TB11 to banish their White Rabbit, I should have read that they had no other extenders. So I should have just used my Dominus Impulse here so that he basically has nothing else he can do. But I don't, and I let that through, and I kind of tunnel a bit on using Impulse on Ransom or White Binder, which this is one of those things that you really have to look at your current game state and kind of read what your opponent has to make your decision. And I make the wrong decision here, but it doesn't end up mattering too much, because my opponent's going to go Lizard, and they go Lizard, banish Dormouse, and I realize here that if I let the Dormouse summon, then they're going to go Dormouse, banish Cheshire Cat from their deck, and then they'll end up having 3 bodies on the field. And so to not like let that get out of control, and also they can use Cheshire to banish and draw 2. And I don't want them to draw too much on the fear of them like drawing Lancia. So I go ahead and just Impulse here and force them to actually have an extender, which if I had made the read correctly, I would have known that they don't have one, and that's exactly what's going to happen. They're going to pass the turn, and during the end phase, I'm going to Magnemite their White Rabbit, and then use Magnemite to go ahead and search for a Druisword. Now, it passes over to me, and my opponent just immediately shotguns the Lancia, so I chain my Druisword to target their Lancia, just to establish a bit more board presence, and also so that I can make my Link 3 later in the turn. And I just go ahead and normal summon my White Rabbit. My opponent is going to imperm the White Rabbit, which makes sense. But here I just go battle phase and I deal as much damage as I can. And then in main phase 2, I link everything off for the White Binder, and I go White Binder, set MTP07 as an interruption, and I just pass it back to my opponent. Now I could have set this Dominus Impulse, but since I'm already locked by this first Dominus Impulse, there's no reason to set it. I could just always play it from my hand. And then my opponent is going to start their turn with an Underground, banishing Dormouse. Now here, I do make the realization that since my opponent didn't play the Underground last turn, then that means that must have been their top deck. Because if they had the Underground last turn, then they would have played the Underground after I impulsed them to banish Chessie Cat from their deck, summon Chessie Cat, and then they can link Chessie and their Lizard into a White Binder or into a Ransom. So here I know that that must be their only starter, so I impulse that, and they go ahead and normal summon Dotscaper and they make Link Decoder. I'm not too threatened by this because there's not anything my opponent can really make here that threatens me. They could go SP to banish my 07, but then I could just chain the 07, and it doesn't really matter if my opponent SPs my White Binder, because then I can just summon her back and get a draw 1. So I'm not very afraid of SP here, and I know that there's nothing they can really make here to really continue comboing. Even if they make Splash Mage, summoning back the Dotscaper does nothing because the Malice Link 3s require at least a Malice monster. So I know that I can just let this go, and they do summon the Splash Mage here, and I know that I'm in a pretty good position, so I just go ahead and use my MTP07, because if my opponent is playing something like maybe Heat Soul, then they could make Heat Soul after they use Splash Mage to bring back Dotscaper. And so just not going to mess with that, and I just go ahead and use MTP07 to banish their Splash Mage, and they're just going to pass back to us with nothing left. And we top deck the Lancia as added insult to injury, but we don't really need it. We have all the gas we need in our hand. So that's going to be it for this video, guys. Hope you all enjoyed, and as usual, if you like this type of video and you want to see more, make sure to let us know in the comments, also by liking and subscribing, or by joining our Discord. Link will be in the description below. See you guys next time.